Good afternoon, folks. I see people are joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. I see folks are joining us. We'll be getting started in a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a little bit after 1 o'clock, and I see most folks have joined us. I know we're expecting a few more, but I think we can get started. Welcome this afternoon to the second session of our series for nonprofit childcare programs and their leadership. I'm Luann Beninati from Let's Grow Kids, and we're excited to sponsor this. I want to thank Maria from Let's Grow Kids, who's always in the background for us, making sure the technology works and moving us along. So Maria's here again today. We have Brenda Metzler, who some of you know and who is so skilled in this work, joining Jane Van Buren, who will lead us through the work this afternoon. Just quickly, because I think if not everyone that's on today was on the first session. Just a quick reminder that folks are muted, and we are really wanting to have your input and your participation. So please use the Q&A box to write questions or comments. Brenda and I will be managing the Q&A, and Brenda will be working with Jane to make sure things are addressed that show up in the box. And we're going to just dive in this afternoon. I know that Jane's got a great presentation for us, and we want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions and conversation. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Luann. Welcome, everybody, to round 2 of Executive Director Nonprofit Boot Camp for informational session. And I'm happy that many of you are on the first session. My slides for this particular session are not going to be quite as dense or quite as many. So I'm really wanting there to be time at the end for discussion, which unfortunately, given the number of you, will be not in person, but through your comments or your questions written in the question and answer box. So take advantage of that, because we really will have time at the end for all sorts of questions. So what I've prepared for you today is this agenda. The specific topics are in response to questions that either board members or EDs wrote when they first registered. So there were questions about recruitment and engagement and orientation. So I went through those. We'll go through those in some detail. And then, as I said, there'll be lots of time at the end for some discussion in the remote sense of the word. So recruitment. You know, first of all, you have to look at what your bylaws require. Obviously, your bylaws should spell out the minimum, maximum number of board members on your for your organization. And if you want to change that, you can. So that's something to think about. You're not, I mean, right now you're held by your bylaws, but if you go through a process to change them, you can create a different size board. And so you want to think about how big you want the board to be. Some executive directors want a really large board because that is more people to do the work, more people to get involved in fundraising. Some executive directors want it to be smaller because it's easier to manage, and you don't get sort of marginalized groups on the board where there are only, you know, only a few people doing the work and the rest of them are just sitting back letting the other ones do the work. With a small group, some executive directors think that there's an advantage in making sure that everybody gets engaged. However, that's a decision that you'll make in concert with your board, your current board, and particularly your board leadership. So what I'm going to go through over the next slides is who and what should you be looking for on your board, and how do you start recruitment. Woo. I'm sorry, I'm at a camp and the wind is really blowing and it just blew open the doors to the porch, so I got distracted. So who's on your board and who is missing? And I'm sure you've all heard about grids that the board members and executive directors will do to go through who's currently on the board and what they bring to the board. If you're looking for diversity, if you're looking for a particular skill set. So we don't have to go through this. You'll have this PowerPoint to look at. But these are things that you can think about who is missing. Like, do you have someone who is a financial person on your board? Do you have someone who understands childcare on your board? Do you have a nice blend of gender? You know, that sort of thing, which is all it's all individual, and for you to figure out with your board what would make the most robust and effective board for you. But wait, I want to make sure that you're not just looking at, okay, we need a lawyer, let's go out and get a lawyer. You really want to look at what people are going to be able to do for you. So, for example, if you have a lawyer on your board, does that person understand nonprofits? Does that person understand or is willing to understand childcare regulations? It's not who you have on your board, but what they're going to be able to bring to the board. You want people to be engaged and create connections that you need. So this is kind of a funny one, but for example, you might try to recruit someone because they have money, but maybe instead of just saying we want you on the board because you're wealthy or thinking that, ask them if they'd be willing to organize with other board members and try to raise money per year as a group so that you engage other people, not just the person who has the money. I know that's a stretch for a lot of you, the idea of raising $50,000, you're probably all laughing, but it doesn't have to be that far-fetched. And I think that as we go through these slides, you might come up with some ideas on your own about how you can engage people in the community. I think last time we talked a little bit of, one of the questions was, is it okay to have non-board members on committees? And fundraising is absolutely a place where it's really fun to have non-board members, because someone who enjoys fundraising but does not enjoy being on a board or the governance of an organization might be willing to pop on to an ad hoc committee once or twice a year to really help create opportunities for raising money. So these are the things that you need to ask. And you need to ask it with your board chair or with the people on the board, depending on how you have organized fundraising on your board. It really should be a full board task and not just a fundraising committee task. I think that you use the fundraising committee to kind of get the things going, but then you bring in the rest of your board members. So ask yourself, what do we want to do this year? Is the most important thing for us to do this year to build a new play structure? Then do you have the right people on the board to make that happen? You have people that are going to be able to bring in the people that you need to do the work, to raise the money, to figure out the legal and legal regulations and to accommodate a new play structure. So really sit down and say, okay, what do I want to get? What do I want the board to accomplish this year? And it might be different from what you want to accomplish as the executive director, but how can you use the board and what do you want them to accomplish this year? And so the point of this slide is to the last bullet, which is really to think about what your organization needs right now. So instead of saying, okay, let's check the boxes for someone who's in government, someone who's in business, someone who's a lawyer, let's think about what we need right now and what kind of people or what skill sets can we match with our organization. So, okay, you're thinking, okay, this is all grand and good, but how do I find these people? And that's always a $64 million question. So here's some ideas. One thing is for you as executive directors to take away from this is that it's not just your job. The board is self-perpetuating, meaning that they really have to play a large role in recruiting their members. They cannot delegate that to you. You should be involved because it's very important for you to have a voice in saying who should be on the board. If you don't have a committee on your board that is responsible for recruitment, you need to create one, and you can work with your board chair to create one. Boards that I have served on and continue to serve on, we have a governance committee, and the governance committee does everything from review the bylaws to recruit committee members to right now we're thinking about how to address anti-racism on the board or anti-racism in the organization. So a governance committee is really a good committee to have on your board to address all sorts of areas of governance, and certainly recruitment of board members is an area of governance. So I would suggest the place to start then is to get that committee up and running and begin with the questions on the previous slide, which, just to refresh your memory, are these questions. Do we have the right people on the board? What do we want to do this year as a board? And then you just need to brainstorm a list. It's really sitting around and thinking about who do we know in the community. You know, you can think that, you know, maybe Jane Jones, you know that Jane Jones has absolutely no time to be on the board, but she's well connected and she might know people who are willing to be on the board. So don't stop yourself. Don't put up roadblocks just because you think someone might not be interested or available to be on the board. You really are going to be able to find folks through other people. And then contact these recruits and set up a meeting. And, you know, everything I'm saying is doubly difficult or doubly challenging now because of the pandemic, but it's really not impossible. And it's going to require you to think creatively. You know, can you set up a meeting by Zoom? Can you meet outside in a park? Can you know, think about ways that you might be able to meet with people and to express your interest in them and see what their interest in you is. So continuing on that, now what? You should be involved and a member of the board, either the board chair and or the board, someone from the board committee, the governance committee, should vet the potential recruits. And you should have a policy. Do you require people to write a letter of interest? Do they send their resume? The most important thing, though, is to really be honest about what you expect. So in order to do that, you have to know what you expect. You know, you have to know, what do we need in this board and what are we wanting people to bring to it? So if you have a fundraising requirement or a giving requirement, you need to make that really clear. And if someone says to you when you're meeting with them, oh, I really hate fundraising, I want to be excused from all aspects of fundraising, they're not the right person for your board if that's a focus of your board. I'm assuming most small nonprofits have to have a fundraising piece. If you don't, then that's fine if that person wants to be on your board. But if you do, say no, that really is a requirement to be on your board. And then if you have a policy, follow it. If you don't have a policy, write one. But how do you bring people on your board? How do you vet them? Do they attend a certain number of meetings? Do they, do a presentation? I don't know what your policy is, but you need to apply it similarly to everybody. And you need a policy that's going to give you time to figure out whether this person's a good fit. And it gives them that time too. So, if they're passionate about your childcare center and they're passionate about wanting their kids in their childcare center, that's a good start. But what else are they going to do for you? Why else do they want to be on the board? Can they raise money? Can they, are they willing to recruit other people? What are they going to do for you? So here are some suggestions. Special events are good places to recruit new board members. So, one idea might be, and again, this is challenging in a pandemic, but ask each board member to invite 3, 5, 7 people to an event. It doesn't have to be a fundraising event. It could be a sort of a get to know us session, informational session. You can talk about your philosophy and your mission. could be you could have small group meetings for every board member's little circle, and talk about why it's important for you to be in the community, what you do with the children, how you work with special needs kids, for instance, how you work with outdoor education, just to educate people in the community who might be interested in the board or know this person on the board, educate them about what you do. And those could be 5 to 7 people who are not parents, right? They could be business people, community members, legislators. It doesn't have to be 5 or 7 people. In fact, 5 or 7 parents. In fact, you wouldn't want it to be parents who are currently in the center, because they should already know about your philosophy and your mission. So expand the circle, invite people to these little Zoom meetings, have your staff and your board, a couple staff, couple board present at the Zoom meeting to talk about the programs and how exciting it is. The other thing you can do is put up recruitment posters. Put up where they make sense, whether it's, at your center, at the local Y, at the grocery store, wherever good gathering places are in your community, you can put up recruitment posters. And always there's the United Way, which I have found helpful, and in fact have recruited several board members through the United Way, because those are people who are looking for something to do to make an impact with the skill sets that they have. Okay, so before we hop into orientation, Brenda, do we have any questions about recruitment?
We don't, but I invite folks to start thinking about what your questions are. I think we're gonna have a really nice question, chunk of time at the end for questions. And when we have Jane here in person, so sort of jot your notes as we go along.
And I'm probably going too fast because I'm used to my first session with all of you when I had, a bazillion slides and not enough time. So I'll try to slow down. But okay, so now the next step, and there were questions about orientation. And so now you've got someone, you voted them on the board. These are the typical list of things that you should have available for new board members to look at. And I write at the top, you don't need to give them a big binder. It's a pain in the neck to lug those things to the meetings. They have to be updated all the time with paper. And in this day and age, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Just get everything. If you have a Google Drive or Dropbox, or even if you send it to them by email, I would recommend that rather than printing out all of these things. But this is the list, and we don't need to go through it, but this is a list of sort of general information that new board members should want to look at. In fact, they might ask you for some of this when you should have a recruitment packet. I should have mentioned that. Some of these things could be in a small recruitment packet when you're talking to somebody. I would think that you'd want someone on your board who is curious about your bylaws, curious about your financials before they were agreeing to be on your board. So that's one way to measure their level of commitment and interest too. So this is just a generic list. So what I would suggest about orientation, which, it's people groan when they think about orientation because they think about long sessions. And what I have found to really work is to break it into sections and then hold the section before the start of the board meeting. So, a new board member could come a half hour early, or the meeting could start a half an hour later. But just hold a half hour to an hour session before the board meeting on particular topics. So your role as the staff person, or your one of your staff, is to talk to them about the finances of the organization, the budget, and program descriptions. Where does your money come from? How much comes in from fundraising? How much from tuition? Do you get grants? And then what do you do with the programs? So those could be 2 separate sections. And then the board's role is to talk about the board's policies. How do we conduct ourselves? What's the expectation for meetings? How do we run our meetings? Do we run it with Robert's rules? Is there a consensus? Really go into detail about these things. And then another helpful, but not very often used, is a mentor. So if you have an experienced board member who is interested and willing to be assigned to a new member, that's a really nice way to make sure that person feels engaged and can get answers to their questions. It's sometimes kind of overwhelming when you're the new person at the table, because everybody knows all the acronyms and they know what's been going on, and you need someone to help them come along with everything, bring up to speed. So the goal of an orientation is to really demystify the organization so that it's not a big mystery about how it's, what the internal operations are. It's not a big mystery. You'll know how many people work there. You'll know what the programs are. And also to help them understand the role of a board member. So, what's the expectation for me as a board member? What happens if I miss meetings? How can I become engaged? What are the opportunities for my engagement? All of those things can be covered in an orientation. All right, so we're moving into fundraising, which I think is my last piece. So are there any questions, Brenda, about orientation?
I see one participant is interested in knowing how to continue to adhere to policies around board orientation over time. So how does one keep sort of the whole board on board with policies and remembering what the bylaws are over time?
That's a great question. And I would say that orientation does not have to be a one-shot deal. So for example, at the annual meeting every year, you can let's do a review of the bylaws. And people will jump up and down at that idea. But, let's review any new, the board should be approving all policies at the annual meeting or at some point during the course of the year. And so what are new board policies that have come up that haven't been vetted by the board? So I would keep it going. It's not a one-time thing. And also, if you expect to be bringing 2 or 3 people into the board over the course of a few months, you can wait and do it when they're all on board rather than having to repeat it 3 times. Mm-hmm. But it would definitely be advantageous to all board members to be oriented and brought up to speed on changes at least once a year.
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Sorry, Brenda. Jane, can you talk a little bit about one of the things that I have witnessed happening is boards and programs that early on set these policies similar to what you've just discussed about board orientation and recruitment in the beginning. And they really put a lot of thought into them and they have them set. And then what happens over time as new boards come in and even sometimes executive directors change, the momentum around continuing to have one board member mentor another, the momentum around remembering to orient. And I remember an experience I had years ago as an executive director when the board president said, Luann, you need to understand that just like with young children who are at different developmental levels, board members are too, and you're forgetting that as the executive director. And I was coming in up here all the time with information, forgetting that not every, and so I know that we have a little bit of time today. I wondered if you could pull that out a little bit, talk a little bit about that. Whose role is it and how do you keep that momentum going and if there are any tips around that?
Well, that's a tough one. And particularly, as you said, Luann, if the ED changes or if the board turns over, the thing that I can stress the most is that the executive director has a role in engaging the board chair. And it's really, if the board chair is enthusiastic and engaged and on top of what needs to be discussed at every meeting and what policies need to be on the forefront, then that will become institutionalized and the next board chair should be able to carry on that level of detail and enthusiasm. That's a big reach, and I'm not saying that lightly. And I think good board chairs are hard to come by. And the executive director has a role in helping that board chair learn what his or her responsibilities are. So, that doesn't really answer your question because I'm not sure there is a good answer for that except to work with the leadership of the board so that they are fully engaged. And that unfortunately is a big part of the executive director's job. I would say the executive director should be meeting with the board chair at least once a month when they're drawing up the agenda and discussing about what needs to happen at the meeting. Are there policies that need to be approved? You know, is it what I would have an annual calendar that says, okay, in January, we're going to talk about this, and in February, we're going to talk about the budget or whatever, you know, however it works in your calendar. And that's a way to keep people on track and keep people engaged. And yeah, did that answer your question?
Well, you know what you're talking about that strikes me as important, and I don't think we often think to name it, is not only do you need an enthusiastic, committed executive director, but you need a board leadership, board president that's passionate and excited about this role. And
Right.
I think maybe that's a piece that, because often in this sector that we're talking about, board presidents are young, overworked, working full-time with 2 children mothers.
Right.
And so they are committed, and yet the passion, and so there's something there. I just want us, as people are listening and thinking, and maybe thinking about their own questions that they might want to ask, just to suss that out a little bit. You did help. I know it's hard to answer, but it is helpful.
Yeah, and I think the executive director should feel empowered to go to the board chair and say, look, I don't think you have enough time. You know, I understand you're passionate. Can you think of somebody else on the board who might be able to give more time to the role of board chair?
And that leads to a contribution that I would like to make. So in my board experience, I think the other thing that helps the continuity of board performance and, you know, high quality board performance and engagement is developing the next leaders from within the board, so that there's shared knowledge, there's sort of board institutional knowledge that continues on even when the current board chair or board president, however you decide to give whatever title is given to that person, when they move on, that the person who steps into that position knows what's going on. They already have a really good, you know, finger on the pulse and already an established relationship with the executive director.
Right. That's a good point. And that's why a lot of organizations have vice chairs or vice presidents with a clear expectation that that person's going to step into the chair or leadership role, the president's role. And so it's very important if someone says, yes, I'll be the vice president, that they realize what that means. It's not just a title, it's an expectation that you're going to be learning from the current chair, and you're going to step into that role and carry on the enthusiasm. And I think that the relationship between the ED and the board leadership, and it could be the whole executive team, is so crucial here to make sure that that is understood and that people are really embracing their role. So, good questions. Where was I? Fundraising. So, are there any more? Sorry, before I go on, Brenda, are there any more questions?
Nope. Whoops.
Okay.
No one has put anything into the Q&A box yet. Perhaps everyone's just absorbing the content and ruminating. But participants, you are welcome to, as you think of things, just jot it in the Q&A box, and I'll bring it up as we go along. So here comes one. How do you weigh the benefits and challenges of having an actively engaged board?
Sorry, say that again. What are the benefits and challenges?
How do you weigh the benefits and challenges of having an actively engaged board?
You know, you want them to be engaged in the right way, right? You don't want them to be engaged micromanaging. You want them to be engaged at a strategic level, and if you're counting on fundraising, you want them to be engaged in fundraising. And you want them to be engaged in really helping you figure things out when you need help. So how do you weigh that? I think you weigh that if they're driving you crazy or not. And, you know, and if they are driving you crazy because they are suggesting things that aren't realistic, and we'll get into this a little bit with this slide, if they're suggesting things that aren't realistic, if they have expectations of you that aren't realistic, if they're micromanaging your operations, that's when you have a problem. And that's when you, as an executive director, either have to work with the board chair or board leadership to clarify the expectations and clarify the capacity you have as a staff to implement some of their ideas. But if you have a board that's engaged in the right way, it's really a benefit to you. You know, if they are not micromanaging you, if they have a lot of trust in you, If they're clear about what their expectations are and they really want you just to manage the means and they'll look at the ends, then it can be a real bonus for you and a real big help. And the alternative is not as helpful. So that's when you would need to, have some frank conversations with your board leadership. And if that doesn't work, then, you need to bring in some kind of training or start working to turn the board over a little bit.
And I think it harkens back to your first presentation a couple of weeks ago, Jane, in being really clear about like the roles and responsibilities. And it's easy for sort of micromanaging to come right out of our mouths, and we like know what it feels like to be micromanaged, but to explain to a board what that looks like you actually don't make the daily schedule for my program. Like I am charged, I as the executive director am
Right.
responsible for being in compliance with the regulations. I am, as the executive director, responsible for the program curriculum. Like you're not responsible for scheduling the subs, etc. Those that role and responsibility clarity that you really stress.
And that gets back to when you're vetting when you're vetting new board members, to make that really clear that, our board operates this way, that we have trust in the executive director to run the organization and run the programs. The board doesn't do that. The board thinks more about, the future and the external environment and strategic thinking. So it has to be an expectation from the very beginning about what the role of the board member is. And, maybe many of you probably have inherited board members, so it's hard, but it takes time to turn the board over into one that's really going to be engaged and in a positive way for you.
There's one more question, but it's related to fundraising. And so I'm going to hold it for now since you're coming into fundraising. Okay. And then we'll address it in a bit.
Okay, so my part about fundraising is somewhat brief. And again, it starts with the staff and board having a little bit different roles, but the first bullet on both of them is what I just said. You got to be clear about it. It can't be a surprise to a board member that they're expected to do XYZ over the course of the year to raise money for the board, for the organization. You need to be clear at the very beginning. This is what our expectation is. So staff play an active role in determining the types of fundraising events or fundraising activities. I have seen so many times when the board will come up with this great idea to raise money, and then they'll turn to the staff and say, okay, do it, without any kind of clear understanding of the capacity of the staff to engage in that. So your role is to really help the board be realistic about the capacity you have to engage in any kind of fundraising. Special events, again, in this pandemic, it's a little bit weird, but special events are fun. They're a whole lot of work. And if you have a board that's expecting you to do the work, I'm sure you're all nodding your heads. It sometimes is not, the cost benefit's not there. So you need to help them figure out what's realistic and what staff capacity is available. Many of you are probably small, you probably don't have a development director, and so you're turning to your board to do a lot of the role that a development office would do. So you need to weigh all those advantages and disadvantages. And you need, as an executive director, to be able to say, no, that's not going to work. We cannot have a golf tournament because we don't have time to work on that. If the board wants to take that and run without any staff involvement, that's a possibility, but that rarely is the case. So boards should be actively engaged in planning an event, or even if it's a mail campaign, they should be providing names of people you can send solicitation letters to. They should be signing the letters. They should be, getting together as a group and having a mailing party kind of thing, or however you do it in your organization. But they need to be involved in expanding your circle of people to write to, people to invite to things. So if they're not doing that, then the money's not going to get raised, because if you're a small center, you don't have the staff time to devote to it. So they need to understand that from the very beginning. But you do have a role to play as the executive director. It's an active role in saying yes or no, and then if you're agreeing to it, then you need to have an active role in keeping the board engaged and involved. So donations, there were a couple questions about donations, so I wanted to just go over that quickly. You know, donations given to you if you're a 501c3 or a religious organization are deductible for the individual. Now, what I didn't say in here, and which I'm sure you all know, is that with the change in the tax law, you have to, in order to be able to deduct any donations that you've given to a 501c3, you have to be able to do a Schedule A. And most people these days are not doing a Schedule A because the bar is pretty high that you have to meet. But if you do get a donation, you don't need to do any more than send a letter thanking them. You don't, and telling them what date you received it and for what amount. And then you can give, if they give you toys and clothes, so an in-kind donation, you don't have to figure out the value. Just give them a receipt saying we received, you know, 5 trucks, and they can figure out the value of that. If you receive stock or real estate as a gift, I would, this actually brings up a couple things. One is you need professional advice, and that might be where a lawyer on your board is helpful. But you need to have a policy. You need to have a donation policy that says this is what we're going to do if we get stock or real estate. Most organizations will turn around and sell it. And that would be their financial gift. I can't remember, I'm blanking on what they're called, but sort of a giving policy that everybody agrees that if we give stock, if we give a gift of stock, we're not going to keep it. We're not playing the stock market. We're going to sell it and put the money into our reserves. But you need to have a policy that outlines that. So again, you're not one of us on this call I'm assuming, are tax professionals. And even if you are, in your role as an executive director, you should not be giving tax advice to someone who's giving you money. So those are just quick donation 101 ideas. And I think this next few slides, and then we'll get into discussion, are just a review of what I showed at our last time together. And this is what I think executive directors should do. You should lead the staff and manage the organization. It's your organization to manage. You have been hired by the board to do that management of the organization. It doesn't mean that you can go rogue or go out ahead of the board, but it does mean that it's your responsibility. It's your responsibility to make sure that the finances are in check, that, you know, that people get paid, that you've got a budget, you've got financial statements. It's also your responsibility to develop and maintain the program so that they're effective, that they're meeting mission, that you're supporting the teachers in those programs. You support the board and you engage them in planning. You know, if you feel like there's a need for a strategic plan, for instance, talk to your board chair or the executive committee or however you've got things, or the whole board, and say, you know, this would be really helpful to have a strategic plan, and start talking to them about what that means and how it would be helpful to you as an organization. Yeah, lead and manage the fundraising with the board support. Or if you have a very small organization, you might be, you know, let the board lead and you'll manage. You can figure that piece out, but either way, you have a role to play there. Implement the budget and the strategic plan. So theoretically, you and your finance person, if that maybe you are both, are creating the budget. The board is looking at the budget, they're providing input, they're approving the budget, but then it's a staff document, it's a staff plan, it's yours to implement. Same with the strategic plan. We covered this a little bit last time. There will be parts of the strategic plan that are about governance, and that's the board's responsibility to implement. But most of strategic plans are about programs and finance, and that would be what you would be implementing. And then finally, to create a safe, accessible working environment. You know, the board could say that I like policies at the board level that say things like, you know, we have a policy that this organization is going to be anti-racist, is going to be safe, it's going to be accessible, and we are trusting you, executive director, to come up with what that looks like. And so they don't get involved in the detail, but they make sure that it's happening. And the anti-racist thing is probably not a good example, because I do think there should be board involvement in that, because it should be on the board level as well. But you want them to be at the level of, okay, we'll let you run until we say stop. You know, we want you to manage this organization. That's why we hired you. And as executive directors, that's what you're looking for in your board. So you're the single point of delegation for the board. And we talked about this a little bit. You do not want your board going around you. They should not be going into classrooms and talking to teachers about their jobs. You know, they certainly can talk to the teachers about their children if they have children in the program. But if they have a question about performance or a question about program direction or about anything, it goes to you. You're the single point of delegation. And if you have a board that's going around you, that's a problem. And that means a conversation. So you're the only employee of the board. And that's, you know, the board creates you and they can fire you, they can hire you. They aren't hiring and firing the rest of your staff. Or they shouldn't be. They should really only be hiring and firing you and empowering you to then go ahead and hire and fire staff. So you're accountable, obviously, for meeting expectations. And again, this goes without saying that if you're supposed to meet expectations, you have to know what they are. If you don't know what the board is expecting you to do, you need to ask. You need to bring that up. And they might not know either. And so it might be a process where you and the board get together and say, okay, let's talk about what what I should be working on this year. And it gets back perhaps to the questions I asked at the very beginning. You know, what do we want to accomplish? What does the board want to be doing this year? What do I, as the executive director, want to do this year? You know, what's the best practice for our organization that we can be looking at this year? And then you had expectations for both board expectations for you and expectations that the board has of themselves. So it's really clear that your job is to support the board, but if the board is not doing their job very well, it's not your responsibility. It makes your life a lot easier if they are, and I think that you do have some accountability and some responsibility in terms of working with the board to help them become the best board that they can be. But you have a busy job to do, and it's not running the board, it's supporting the board. And again, I said this earlier, but you're responsible for your staff. The board's not responsible for your staff, and if they think they are, then we can help them figure out that they're not. Okay, that was it for me, and it's 1:40, so we have lots of time left over. We knew this one might be a little bit shorter than the other ones. But I'm hoping we can have some back and forth discussing. So what are we doing there, Brenda? Do we have some?
We have some great questions and opportunities for discussion. And I would like to clarify something that I said just a few minutes ago about how the executive director is responsible for meeting the regulatory requirements, and what I meant, and that's not the board's job. And so just a point of clarity around that, which was raised by a participant, it is the executive director's responsibility for meeting the regulatory requirements on a daily basis, so implementing and compliance and all of that. But it is also the responsibility of the board is ultimately responsible for hiring and supporting an executive director who knows what those are and is doing that job. And so it's a performance measure, as you indicated just a couple of slides ago. So the board needs to be aware of licensing requirements and have that have compliance be a performance expectation for the director. And if there's any regulatory action, ultimately the board is responsible. And when they're minor violations, no biggie. When they're serious violations, it's a job for the board. So I wanted to clarify remark.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. And that gets back to what we talked about a few weeks ago about the fiduciary responsibility of the board, which is another piece of orientation and talking about what it means to be a board member is, what the board is ultimately responsible for. So yeah, like if the organization doesn't pay its taxes, then the board is ultimately responsible for that. So anyway.
Which also then is just, it really magnifies the need for that good working relationship between the ED and the board of directors, and the board president being able to have that regular open communication. So here's one. You talked about the importance of the relationship between the board president and the director. The executive director having a say about who is on the board is a new concept to me. Usually if someone wants to volunteer, they're welcome to join the board. And with this in mind, how do you respond to a board member who wants to step up maybe as board president when you don't think it will be a good thing or a good fit, especially if no one else is volunteering?
Yeah, oh boy, that's a tough one. There's a certain amount of politicking that goes on. And there's a certain amount that if you really feel strongly that the person that wants to be the board president is not going to be the right person for the job, and you think there might be someone else on the board who is, I think conversations can start. You can have conversations, and you can have transparent conversations. You talk to the person that is volunteering and express your concern about their level of time and the amount of commitment that it's going to take, the amount of time it takes to be an effective board chair, and you're wondering if they have that kind of time. You can be nice about it. And then you could maybe suggest somebody else on the board who might have more time or might, it's tricky. It's really tricky. And you might have to go through a year of someone who's not so good to sort of put things in place to get to the point where you are, the next year. I'm assuming all of your bylaws call for annual election of officers. So that's something to check to make sure that that's not happening. Board members, whatever your bylaws say, board members can be elected for 2 years, 3 years, whatever, or indefinitely, however your bylaws are presented, but officers should be elected every year. So it might take you 2 or 3 years to get the board in place that you think is going to be the most effective and engaged for you. But it's about being transparent, about being open, about having conversations, talking truthfully about what you expect of a board chair, what would be helpful for you, and can they really meet that? So I don't have an easy answer to that one, because there is not an easy answer to that one.
I think one of the things that's a little bit different with this sector than if we were talking to executive directors of bigger, more visible, large nonprofits with sort of higher visibility, and that is childcare programs are often looking for board members, struggling to find board members, going to their current families for board members. And so I think your early slides around recruitment outside of the board of parents that's the key, really important suggestion. Yeah. And I wonder if we wanted to spend some time kind of brainstorming that a bit. Yeah. And then all of your conversations about, having the job descriptions and clarity around roles so that what you just said can happen, a frank conversation about really this is what's needed, and are we, the executive director and the potential board president, a good match? And if not, who might be a better match? Right. And I think also sometimes giving that person a role that makes them feel, you talked in the first session about board members feeling like their time is being used well, like there's a reason they're there, and thanking them. And so sometimes I think we forget about giving people a role so they feel important and that their time is worthwhile and that they're having impact. And so right. I think when you talk about the politicking, I think there's so many nuances of that, and it's really important. So I appreciate you bringing up those, sort of, I know it's not easy and it's politicking, but there's all little nuances that are important to bring up right. in terms
right. I agree. And I have to say that, unless you're like the Flynn Theater or the hospital board or something, it's always a struggle to find board members. It's easier if you have a board chair or a committee that's really engaged in getting that process going and but even then it's a struggle to find good board members or to find people who have the time and have the understanding to do it. But I think yeah, what you referenced, Luann, is going back to that slide that I had in the beginning about, I'm sure there's a better way to do this. Where did I have it about having like a, well, I don't know what I did, but having each board member invite 5 people to a meeting about the organization. I don't know what slide that was on, and I don't want to waste the time looking for it. But I have found in my there we go. I have found in my experience that that's a really good way to bring board members on. And if once we're through this pandemic and you can go back to having an annual event where people are in person, make it clear when you're recruiting board members that you would expect them to invite 5 people to an event that, so they could learn about the organization. That I have found to be one of the most effective ways for people to get excited about your organization. Even if they're not a parent, someone might have interest in, a lot of people have interest in the future of this country. And, you are running organizations that are working with or taking care of or educating the future of our country. And so, you can talk about what's your philosophy about that. How are you approaching play? How are you approaching sharing? How are you approaching outdoor education so that they can get excited in what the future might hold? I think that you have to be creative. You just have to think of other ways to engage people and think about it outside of just your parent body.
There's a really good comment in the Q&A box from a program about how they handle this, which prompted me to recognize that this is how we handle it at a board on which I serve as well. And here's the comment: we take applications for our board, and if the skill set doesn't match what we're looking for, we find other ways to engage them, either on a board committee or through a special project. Our bylaws also limit the number of family representatives that we can have on the board, so we're able to have a balanced voice and perspective.
That's a great comment. Yeah.
The other thing that I want to just mention, because I've observed this over time, is being on the board of a child care program is often the first time a person volunteers to be on a board. And I've observed those people go on to being school board members, legislators, and on bigger, more visible boards with broader impact across the state. And so I think one of our recruitment tools that we might not think about enough is, if you are the person that you just described, Jane, who wants to be a part of making the world a better place, and you're interested in being on a board, there's no better, maybe even a little less pressured place to start learning about how to be a board member than in your child's child care program.
Yep.
So it's a great stepping stone, and I think sometimes we forget to use that as a recruitment tool.
Right. And just to follow up on that, I didn't mean to disparage parents on boards, because clearly many of us have been parents on boards, and it was a good experience. And I think Luann, that's so true, that it's a good stepping stone, but they need guidance. So you need to have that kind of framework in place so that they can reach their potential as a board member in a way that's not exhausting for the executive director. So that, if you have good policies in place, that the mentoring piece, and if you have a strong board president that can help guide that will make that a much more effective process.
So we have a couple of other suggestions of things to talk about, and also one question, and some of them are sort of specific relevant issues right now. I just want to open the floor for questions. If you have something that's really specific to your program now, we may or may not be able to answer it in full here and now, but put it in the Q&A box anyway, and we'll see what we can do. So in your professional opinion, Jane, do you think that directors find more freedom maybe in being involved strategically if the board is more passive?
Okay. Yeah, maybe. I think though that it takes a specific kind of organization for that to work well. It takes an executive director who's highly competent, and I'm sure all of you are. And it takes an organization that doesn't have a lot of crises. But yeah, sure. If you have a board that just gets together every other month and sort of chats with you about what's going on, and approves things that need to be approved, your job is a lot easier. But you're missing out on a lot of advantages of having an engaged board that's going to move your organization forward in a way that you can't imagine. That is going to be on top of what's going on externally, can bring really rich conversations to the board that you can be involved in, can know when to step out and when to step in. And, that's a board that everybody aspires to and takes time and effort to get it there. So, the alternative of passive board that's going to let you do whatever you want to do sounds nice when you're thinking about the amount of work it takes to build a really effective board, but it's worth it, I think, in the end. Having served on boards that were really effective and boards that weren't, I'm staying on the ones that are really effective because it's engaging to be on it. It's exciting to hear what's going on in the organization because the executive director is really on top of things. It's exciting to have, high-level strategic conversations with the full board about what's going on in the environment. So, you can pick what's going to work for you, but I have to say, don't ignore the fact that a fully engaged, excited board is going to lead you into really great places.
Absolutely. I was thinking about, oh, sorry, Luann.
No,
I
go
was
ahead.
thinking about generative conversation, the things that get generated by an engaged board can sometimes just take us way outside of the parameters of our own thinking.
And I would challenge us to think about sustainability of our programs. When the executive director takes everything on herself, and then should a time come when she leaves, there often is a real struggle for the program to sustain at the same level of quality. Whereas if you've got this high functioning board executive director relationship, changes in the people filling the roles happen while the program continues at a higher level. So it sometimes is challenging to deal with the board, and it would be easier to do it yourself, but I think you miss out on the pieces that Brenda and Jane just described.
With a caveat, perhaps, Pat, you have to have that balance that they know what their job is. So, if they're excited and engaged and active and in your space all the time, that's not good. And then, you need to move them out and get them to a point with, that's where the work is. That's hard. It's hard work and it might take a while. And you would really, really, really dream of a board that did absolutely nothing, because then you could get on with your work, and I get that. I totally get that.
We have, thank you. We have two questions related to fundraising. And one is, what are some COVID fundraising ideas? I'm going to ask them both, and then we can sort of decide how to approach. But, and the other is, can you talk about how an organization sets annual fundraising goals and how this interacts with the budget, and also how it influences, for example, affordability for families?
Affordability for families, yeah. Wow, okay, so there are three questions in there. One is, how do we fundraise in COVID? And I have to say that I am relying on people who know a lot more than I do about social media. I am on this board, and we usually have an annual breakfast that it's a long process, and we're part of this Benavon model, which I'm not going to get into now, but if anybody's curious, I'm happy to talk to them about it. Anyway, this annual breakfast that brings in over $120,000 a year in pledges, and we were all like, what are we going to do this year? And then it has a development team. So I'm not suggesting that you have to do this. Who knew about how to do all of this online? And that, COVID ideas are, go to social media, figure out, people were doing Facebook videos talking about the organization and getting people to pledge. There was all sorts of other stuff going on social media that I am totally clueless about. So I'm not the right person to answer that, but I think the answer to how you raise money in COVID is you raise it remotely. You raise it by creating videos, by sharing those videos, and by asking people for money on social media and in the mail. So Brenda, what were the other questions? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. One was about how to keep fundraising sort of in the thinking and as a regular part of what of the ED and board work together. So can we talk about how an organization sets annual goals and fundraising goals and how that interacts with the budget and ends up influencing things like affordability for families when it comes to childcare programs? So it gets at sustainability as well.
Yeah, if I could do a poll right now, I would have asked how many of you have scholarship built into your budget. And, that's something that needs to be raised by fundraising generally, is the scholarship amount. So that might be one thing that's sort of set in stone every year. We're going to raise money for X number of families to get some sort of subsidy for their tuition. So that might be one thing that gives you a goal right there. The really quick short answer is you look at your budget, you look what's coming in from tuition and fees, and you look at what your expenses are, and the gap has to be filled by fundraising. I mean, that's the really short, quick and dirty answer to that. And so as you're working the budget, you going to the board and saying, okay, it looks like we're going to need to raise $40,000 this year to cover our expenses. How realistic is that? And then how can we do it? And if it's not realistic, if the board says, we absolutely cannot raise that amount of money, then you have to look at what else could happen. Do you raise tuition? Do you decrease staff? Do you not do the program you were planning to do? I think one area that I have found boards getting really frustrated is that this ED comes in and says, okay, this board has to commit to raising $40,000. And the board doesn't have a sense of how that happens, what they're supposed to do. And board members can't pay it out of their own pocket. So how do we figure out how to raise it? And that's where the ED can come in with helpful suggestions at how it could be raised. Bring in that social media expertise from your kids, or somehow help the board figure it out. But it's hard to throw an amount at the board and have them be excited about raising it when they haven't been part of the process of determining the goals. So if you have a development committee, a fundraising committee on your board, they should be able to help you with that. They should be able to help think about how we're going to raise the money we need to keep this center going.
So let's imagine that fundraising has never been done by your organization. How do you get a board on board? So get them to not only approve of some kind of fundraiser, but to actually take an active role so that it's successful?
Well, hopefully you've got at least one or two champions on your board who might be interested in raising money. Some people really love doing it, and hopefully you have at least one person on your board who is excited about the possibility of raising money for the center. And you need to get them involved and get them to recruit other people on your board to also be involved. And as I said before, it's a really good place to bring people into committee who aren't on the board. Other parents are great, and it's a process. I call it drinking the Kool-Aid sometimes. It's a process to get people invested in the idea of, okay, I'm on this board, and part of my role on this board is to make sure that we're bringing money in. And if I am not able to do that or interested in doing that, then perhaps this is not the board for me to be on. And you need to have those kind of frank conversations with your board, or the board chair should be having those conversations, not you. The board, someone in leadership on the board needs to be having those kind of conversations with board members, laying it out, being really transparent about what the need is for money in this organization, and how we can let's think about how we're going to get it. How much do we usually get from mail campaigns, or, estimate if you've never done it before. Are board members making a personal gift? How much do you have an expectation for that? You should. Every board member should be making a personal gift that's a challenge for them. It could be $50, it could be $10, it could be $5,000, but it's an expectation, and many grants funders want to know that everybody on the board's made a personal contribution. So that should also be an expectation. So have those conversations. If you have a small enough board to have it with the full board, I would encourage that and really get people so that their level of understanding about the need for the money is really clear.
Right. I was just thinking, connect it to what it is, like connect it to the mission of your program, connect it to what the board is saying is important to them about moving this program forward. And you said something about it's a process. I think, it harkens back to that inviting potential recruits to learn more about your program, your organization. And then, it takes time. It's like it's developing the relationship, and the participant said about their board, engaging on some level, even if it's not initially on a board, in a board member capacity, but a sort of courting of potential people. And it perhaps that becomes one of the things on your list of criteria for for board member, potential board members. Yeah, did you want to say more about that, Luann?
No, I had another thought that I wondered if Jane would weigh in on. What are your thoughts about putting the efforts in to come up with a annual sort of connected to your organization fundraising event? Is it worth the time, or does that just depend on the organization to have the every June we do the something that becomes associated with your program? The work involved in that, is it worthwhile? Is it helpful? Is it a transitional? It might work sometimes, might not. Just
Yeah,
wondered about your thoughts on that.
it is very individual to the program, I think, and you have to be in it for the long haul in order, I think, in order for it to really pay off. Like if you look at certain events, that Alzheimer's Walk and the COTS Walk and I don't know, bike rides that people have been doing for years, it starts out small and then it grows and grows and grows. It takes a lot of staff time. And so, you know, that really is individual to the organization to think about what capacity do we have on staff, what capacity do we have on board to make this happen. Do we have a place in the community where we can gather post-COVID that's not going to charge us an arm and a leg? You know, what's the best way to get this, you know, do we really want people running around getting donated items for a silent auction? You know, no, you don't want staff doing that. If the board's excited about that, let them do that. But you really need to be clear about the amount of staff time. And if you've got teachers in the classroom all day long, they're not going to be going down and asking for gift certificates. You know, it's, but the board can do that if they want to do that. I think from a PR point of view, they're very helpful. And if you go in knowing that for the first couple of years, maybe it's not going to get you, maybe you're going to lose money, but people will begin to know who you are. You have to weigh, does that make sense? Is that worth it? And it's really got to be individual. I tend to groan when boards come up with fancy event ideas because they frequently don't understand the amount of logistics and legwork it takes to pull them off. And you might not either as an executive director until you've been through it. And so it could be just a real bomb, or it could be the bomb. You know, it could go either way.
A bomb or the bomb?
A bomb. But I think you have to go in with a clear head about what's involved.
And perhaps have, go ahead.
No, just what you want to get out of it too. Are you going in thinking it's just PR? Or are you going in thinking we're going to raise $5,000? If you're going in rethinking you're going to raise, you know, $100,000 on your first event, you won't. So, you know, be really realistic about what you can do. And I think you'll find if you bring, I keep going back to getting your board members to invite 5 people to a little Zoom meeting. I think if you find that if you do those sorts of things on a regular basis, like maybe every month, once a month, you pick, you know, Joe on the board and Joe's 5 friends, and you have a Zoom meeting with them. And then the next month it's Susan's friends on, you know, somehow be creative through COVID to do that. I think you'll find that you then are adding people to your mailing list. You're adding people you're adding donors, you're adding prospective donors, you're adding people who can then go out in the community and talk about what you do and excite other people about you. And I think over the course of a year, you'll find that has some sort of a snowball effect and you'll start getting more interest in the organization. So
one of the things you just mentioned that I think is so important and is so easy to lose track of is the mailing list. You know, every year you have this group of committed families, and you really, as your program ages, you don't want to lose the connection with them. Right. They are, if not an opportunity to raise funds, they are that community connection. And I think that as childcare leaders, technology and systems are not the first things we've thought about. And so having a database with your mailing list is key, and many of us don't have that.
Right.
So
and it can be an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be a fancy database. And keep track of who you've mailed to, how much they've given, whether they attended an event or a Zoom meeting, you know, who their connection is with the organization. You know, just keep track of those details. But I agree, Luann, keeping particularly since you all have alumni, you know, keeping that active is great.
Another important thing when you think about developing or even continuing fundraisers. Often fundraisers are founded in a like sort of a place and a time, and like one or a small group of people have a lot of passion behind, you know, the pancake breakfast or the annual auction or the Apple Day or whatever your fundraiser is, or whatever you're conceiving as one. I think it's really important to build in an evaluation process, and that it should be not only evaluated like immediately after, like how did this go, what went well, what would we change, and sort of, you know, is our bottom line different in the better or the not, but you know, then sort of like ask the hard questions, like, is this something that we would have the energy to do again? So that, you know, you develop a process for evaluating, so that you don't continue to kill yourself every year for something that you make 50 cents on or lose $100 or whatever. There's another question that is very specific to a kind of program, but I think it could also be applicable in other settings. So it is passive versus active board follow-up. As a church ministry, so this program is a designated church ministry, and they are limited to board members being members of the founding church. So the issue can make, you can imagine, finding board members that are engaged and have the right skill set challenging. And I think, you know, it could perhaps be parallel to other, maybe not religious organizations, but other organizations that are really closely aligned with some other entity. Maybe they're serving like the faculty and staff of a college, or maybe they're serving like all the employees of a hospital or something, you know, where sometimes there are sort of structures that limit this, what we've just been talking about, expanding the board in ways that really support the work. So help. So
what was the question in there, Brenda? How do you recruit it that way?
Well,
or?
Yeah, I guess so. How do you handle that? How do you handle a situation where board membership has strict criteria already in place? And in this case, it's a religious organization.
Yeah.
So they have to be a member of the church for whom this program, or
Right.
of whom this program, of which this program is a ministry. So it's a branch of the church's mission.
Well, I guess I would ask, in this particular, in these situations, is the church funding the center? You know, does the board need to be a fundraising board, or are they getting, you know, funding from the church? Because that really changes what you're expecting the board to do. But then, you know, if it's not, if it's not a fundraising board, and you still have to work with board roles and board responsibilities, and making sure that you have the leadership you need on the board, even if it's from a contained, you know, contained profile, contained group. You know, there's talent everywhere, and you are restricted. If you're restricted by the hospital or the, you know, university or the church by whom you may have on your board, you'd be restricted by your bylaws. I would think if you're incorporated as a C3 or incorporated as an organization, you know, the organization should have some sort of governing documents that spell out the expectations or the requirements of board membership. So you have to work with that. In that, you know, if you can't change it, you have to work with it, and you can still do the work as an executive director to try to build the enthusiasm and engagement on the board to be strategic about the organization.
And it makes me think too that it would, you know, and this is me talking because I might be a boundary pusher sometimes, but I think I would raise the question and just say, hey, I wonder if there would be a way to expand our potential board member pool. And then you could, you know, sort of think about criteria that would align with whatever the mission of, you know, whatever it was that made them think that it should be only members of this community. You know, so could we say that these are still values that align with our mission, but could we expand our potential member pool in some way? So I might just raise it, period. I would raise it.
And it might be a good place to bring maybe if they don't want to go all the way, they could say, okay, non-church members or could be on committees. that might be a way for you to get the kind of work you need or the engagement you need from a committee member. So that might be a possibility, but I agree, it's worth asking the question if we can change this policy.
The comment in response is it would require a change to the bylaws, in this case of the church. And that's exactly right. It would most likely in any organization require a change to the bylaws, because that's what's sort of creating the situation in the first place. And the good news is that bylaws should be revisited and reviewed periodically, preferably every year or two. But absolutely, and bylaws are changeable. So that, I think the good news is bylaws are changeable.
They're changeable, absolutely, if you have the will of the organization to change them. So that's the work you need to do to help them understand that this would be beneficial to the nonprofit, to the child care center if these bylaws were changed. But yeah, totally agree with you, Brenda, that bylaws should be reviewed annually and should be updated as needed. And that gets back to my very first slide about how big do you want your board to be? And if you have bylaws that say the board is 5 people and you are realizing you can't move from A to Z with 5 people and you need more, then that's an opportunity to change the bylaws. And conversely, if the bylaws say you have to have 25 people on the board and you can't find enough people to fill those, that's another opportunity to change the number in the bylaws. So it's all doable. It's all just a question of you thinking with your board leadership about what you need and what's going to make the most sense.
Are there other questions? Thank you, Jane. Are there other questions that you have for Jane that are perhaps things that you're living through or experiencing currently, in addition to what are great fundraiser ideas for during COVID? And if anyone has great fundraising ideas for COVID, go ahead and type it in the Q&A box. I'll say them out loud. Like that's totally fine with me.
Well, and one of the reasons we did the second separate session without board members was so that there would be comfort in addressing some issues that might not be comfortable to address when you have board members on with you. And so, we know many of you have very well functioning boards and good relationships between the director and board, but are there issues that you've just found challenging around dealing with the board? And let's pick Jane's brain while we have her, because she's so skilled and helpful in this area. Or you covered everything so well that
Luann, do you want to talk about the follow-up sessions?
Yes. So thank you, Jane. So the recording from both of these sessions and the PowerPoints from these sessions will be on the Shared Services website, sharedservicesvermont.org, as well as the Let's Grow Kids website for you to revisit. So just want to let you know that this was these workshops, these webinars were have credit through Northern Lights, so you will get credit hours through Northern Lights for attending. And our agreement with Jane, she's been so generous to offer 8 short consults with the first come, first serve, the first 8 programs who had people that attended both sessions. So you had to have been at both the first and second session, your program, not all staff from the program, but at least a representative at each session. And the first 8 folks who reach out to Jane, and her information to contact her is right here on the screen now. And also you'll receive the PowerPoint, so you'll see it. Reach out to her directly. The first 8 people, free consult. She's also, I think, available if your board looks at this as a longer term sort of work that you'd like to do. I'm not, not speaking for Jane, but she also does this work for pay. So that certainly is an option as well. So we hope that 8 of you reach out and get the free consult. And Yeah, for me, this has been really valuable, both sessions, the information and the issues that have come up and the options of how to deal with things has been really helpful. I don't know, Brenda and Jane, do you have parting thoughts?
We have one more question. If we can get that in, that would be great. And I echo Luann, like take it, make full use of Jane's expertise and availability. And yeah, so, and Jane, really grateful that you brought what we realized is a really important conversation and discussion to the field. So what is a recommended way to introduce the concept of board member roles to a long-established board that only has a chair as in sort of formal role at this point?
Only has a chair in a formal role, so meaning the chair is not stepping up to chair responsibilities?
The chair, so I'm not exactly sure. The way I read it was there's a board of directors.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long-standing group of people, and there's only one formal role, and that is there's a chair of the board. That, in other words, there would be no secretary, no treasurer, no vice chair coming up. No, yeah.
Well, as I've been saying all along, this is a lot of hard work and it's a process. So the way that I would start with that is to meet with the board chair and say, if it's not working for you, I mean, if you're fine with the way it is and you're being able to meet your budget and your staff are happy, then maybe it's fine. There's nowhere written that says, well, there is the law, you do need to have officers. So there's that problem. But beyond the law, there's nowhere written that you have to have a formal board committees or have a formal process, but you need to know, the board needs to know what they're doing and why they're there, and you need to understand why they're there as well. So if you're happy with it and nothing's going wrong, you might want to introduce the idea that the Vermont law does say that you need to have a secretary and a treasurer, and get that going. If you're not happy with it and you wish you had more help from your board, or you feel like the board is not embracing its fiduciary responsibility, then I would start by having a conversation with the board chair and trying to figure out where you can introduce the idea of board roles, where you can introduce the idea of expectations. I would imagine that you're not being formally evaluated if that's the case. And so you might want to introduce the idea of that being helpful for you in terms of your job performance and your job growth. So just bite off little pieces and start with that one person. And if the board chair is not at all interested in making any changes, you've got a hill to climb with that. If it's there's certain things that you're not going to be able to change. There's certain things that you can introduce and see where they go. You could start with some of these PowerPoints, and but definitely, if you don't have officers, you need to. You were incorporated with them, so you need to have officers on the board, and you need to have an annual meeting. Those are the two requirements from Vermont state law.
I'm curious, in terms of the kinds of support that you hope to offer to folks who do reach out. Would it be possible for say the ED who asked that question to have the board chair present for the conversation with you?
Well, certainly I'd be open to it. It's the question of whether the ED is comfortable with that as an idea. But certainly if anybody can reach out to me and ask me what would make sense, and if you want to have a 5-minute preliminary, how are we going to structure this conversation with me, and then we go ahead and have it at another time, that's fine too. But sure, I'd be totally willing to do that. It's boards are tricky. They're really tricky, and they're Drucker always said you have a group of people with really smart people who become idiots or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but when they get together, you've got all these smart people in their lives as parents and as busy professionals or whatever background they bring to your board, and yet when they get together, it's hard for them to embrace their role and know what they're supposed to be doing and being strategic about moving forward. And so a lot of your work is unfortunately to help them in that process. And making sure that you get some board turnover so you can bring in people that are going to be of a different mindset.
And one of the things, Brenda, if I could just jump in really quickly, one of the things that dawns on me as I listen to this conversation is the field of childcare and running a childcare business has changed pretty dramatically over the past 20 years and even, more recently. And so if you, I'm not sure the situation in the program where this question is coming from, but if this is a program that's been around for a long time that was run in a bit of an informal way, more like a church nursery, less like a licensed program, one of the ways into the conversation with the board might be things have changed in the world of running a child care program. Things were much less formal, and they're not anymore. This is a business. It's a as you have been so helpful, Jane, pointing out the legal parts of it and the formal parts of it, and so that might be a way into the conversation with the board.
Thank you.
And I was going to, yes, absolutely. And so everything Luann said, and that's a good thing. I think sometimes, boards need to be brought along to the, it is different, it is more formal, it is highly regulated, and that's a good thing. So that we bring them along on that piece of it. And Jane mentioned in passing Drucker, a quote from Drucker, and I would just say, if you're not familiar, Peter Drucker actually spent his life teaching and developing methods for management and management relationships. And I think he has a book called The 5 Most Important Questions to Ask Yourself as a Board Member or something like that. I just remember I had to read his book for a board that I served on. This was several years ago now. But I just remember, even though I can't remember the title of it right now, I just remember that it was Peter Drucker had really instructive and useful things to say. So he is one of the resources that you might want to avail yourself of if you're the kind of person who enjoys reading, that kind of evening reading.
Well, another place to look. Thank you for bringing up places to go. Is BoardSource. If you go on their website, some of their materials you have to pay for, but some of them are free. And then if you go on compasspoint.org, they're out of San Francisco, and they have an awful lot of free material, free reports that they've written, research reports that they've written that are very accessible, lots of graphics. And then, of course, Shared Services is another place to go that you can get information. So it might be helpful for you to print out some information and come to the board saying, I really would like you all to read this. It doesn't have to be Peter Drucker, who might be a little bit heavy to get through. But there's some more interesting reports, not more interesting, there are some interesting reports that have that are lighter and more user-friendly that you could say to the board, let's read this and talk about it.
Accessible, right?
Accessible, thank you.
And sometimes too, it could be like, here's just this chunk, like let's talk about this piece.
Yeah.
Instead of throwing the whole Peter Drucker Bible at them, because that's some dense weighting, I'll tell you. And I just would point out that in the first session that you attended, the very last slide had included some of the resources that were just mentioned, including and a few others. So when you get the PowerPoint, you can just click right on those links and they'll take you to some really good sources and resources for boards. And I actually have resources for helping you figure out how to talk to your board.
And we will get those up as quickly as we can. So we are coming to the end of our time. Jane, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. We appreciate your expertise and sharing it with us, and Brenda, you as well. And we also really appreciate you folks, who I know half of you are rubbing backs at nap time while you're participating in this. So thank you for taking the time to join us for this. Let us know at Let's Grow Kids. Reach out to Brenda or me at letsgrowkids.org if you have further questions or ideas for additional work that you would like to see us address in terms of nonprofit childcare programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. Can't guarantee that we'll be able to jump on it right away, but we do want to hear from you. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jane.